hadn't noticed this in reading James and rereading him until last year when I was teaching a course on him. And of course, because these matters were pressing on me, especially the idea of the word soul, what you do with it, what you think about it as a novelist. When we were reading his short story, The Aspern Papers, which is really about greed and obsessiveness and, and time passing, and his late novel, The Golden Bowl, which is about money and treachery and indecency, I began to notice that he was able to use the word soul. For example, at the very end of the Aspern Papers, when Miss Tina has been rejected, in other words, Miss Tina has said to our protagonist, if you want the Aspern Papers, marry me. And he has said, marry you? I won't marry you. And he goes away. And when he comes back, he notices in her an extraordinary alteration. And this is the quote. She stood in the middle of the room with the face of mildness bent upon me. And her look of forgiveness, of absolution, made her angelic. This optical trick gave her a sort of phantasmagoric brightness. So then he goes to say goodbye to her. And she replies that she won't see him again and she doesn't want to. And then she smiles strangely with an infinite gentleness. Now listen to this. And this is James. This is a quote from the Aspern Papers. And now she had the force of soul. Miss Tina with the force of soul was a new conception to smile at her in humiliation. The force of soul. James uses the term twice as though it has a clear meaning. It's hard not to wonder if he meant that this force was available to Miss Tina because she'd suffered. And because she'd been despised, she had lived in darkness, and only as a result of her suffering did this force of soul emerge. There's a scene as well in The Golden Bowl where Maggie Verver, whose husband is having an affair with her best friend, who happens also to be her father's second wife. It's terrific stuff. She goes outside when the four of them, her father, her friend, her husband, and her mother-in-law, her husband's lover, are playing bridge or playing a game of cards, and she watches them through the window. And what she watches, what she experiences, this is a quote from James, is the horror of finding evil seated at all its ease where she had only dreamed of good. The horror of all the thing hideously behind. But just go back again. The horror of finding evil seated all at its ease where she'd only dreamed of good. Just as it should be simple to find another less religious term. In other words, if I were rewriting the Aspern Papers and trying to get religion out of it, I would get a term like the force of soul. You could change it to something like a fierce dignity that came from within her. That would be one possibility. And so too, with the Golden Bowl, it should be possible to replace evil with treachery. But James uses his words with care. If he had wanted to use secular terms in these scenes, he would have done so. Instead, he wanted to invoke something deeper and more urgently mysterious, beyond human explanation, extreme. And it's interesting that the lexicon he wanted to raid was actually a religious one. And later on in the book, he will have the adulteress, and when she's speaking, she will sound like a soul, like the shriek of a soul in pain. Once more, he can use the word soul. Other novelists, such as James Joyce, who I'll end with, had managed to weave religion into a larger fabric, including put a great deal of blasphemy into his books. The opening of Ulysses has a sort of mock mass where Buck Mulligan intones the opening of the Latin Mass in Tribo ad altare Dei. And there's a wonderful moment in Ulysses where Leopold Bloom, he's passing a church, and he's Jewish, and he's thinking about the Catholic Mass, and he's thinking about the whole idea of changing bread and wine into the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. And you're thinking, what a clever idea to use wine. Wine is a very dignified drink. He thinks, if it was ginger ale, if you said that it was going to change ginger ale into the blood of our Lord Jesus, people wouldn't believe that religion at all. It's just a funny, it's one of my favorite little moments in Ulysses. But in his collection, Dubliners, Joyce also weaves the theme of music into the fabric of the narrative. In the sixth story of the stories, called Two Gallants, the figures in the story, they're walking almost aimlessly in the city. It's filled with rich detail, with exactitude. But as they turn from Nassau Street into Kildare Street, they hear music. The music they hear has no overt function in the construction of the story. Rather, its function is buried in the undercurrent of the story, part of its rhythm or dynamic or its essence, rather than, say, part of its plot or its surface. It's here as a sort of shivering example of what lies under things to place against the hard detail of motive and action and sentiment in the story. And it reads, not far from the porch of the club, a harpist stood in the roadway, and then it goes into detail over the harp being played. In a later story in Dubliners, a story called Clay, Maria, who's a middle-aged spinster, she goes and visits this family who she used to know. And there's a really strange moment in the story where it's Halloween and you can blindfold people and put something in their hand. And she puts her hand out, and what you would get, say, could be a ring. And that would be meaning, oh, you'll be getting married soon. It's an innocent game, but she's blindfolded. And what they do is they put clay. They go outside and they get clay from the garden. She's blindfolded, but she feels this. Sorry, I just found the quote now. She felt a soft, wet substance with her fingers, and was surprised that nobody spoke or took off her bandage. Suddenly, something new has been brought into the story. Instead of parties or visits or even innocent singing, death has come. Something new has come into the story. And the problem Joyce has now is that the secular space of the story has been disturbed. So how is he going to deal with this? How do you get out of a story once you put that in? So one solution would be to have Maria allow her to have a sort of visionary experience. Let her look at the stars, or allow a totalizing image, a way of moving above and beyond the limits of the story towards some other space, or using rhythm or image to get that. But the solution James Joyce chooses, however, which we often watch Thomas Mann doing when he has a similar dilemma, is he uses music. So at the end of the story, they ask Maria to sing, and she sings an aria from a light opera called I Dreamt I Dwelt in Marble Halls. And she sings the first verse, and then instead of the second verse, she repeats the first verse, which is a sort of further disruption of things. And the emotion comes from the invocation of a song. There's a later story in Dubliners, a story called A Mother, which is entirely different, where the mother simply has a daughter who sings in 4 concerts. And she discovers that since no one has attended the first 3, that they're not going to pay the daughter. And so the story becomes about money. Once more, music moves, as in Edith Wharton, into the background. The hard business of people wanting things, and things being real and exact, and you can count them, emerges in the story. And it's perhaps doing that in the story A Mother in Dubliners left James Joyce free for the use of music as the nourishing and uplifting and binding ingredient in The Dead, which is the final, I suppose, and most famous story in Dubliners. So we must remember about The Dead that the 3 denizens, the 3 women who are giving the party, which takes up the body of the story, that they are involved in the world of Dublin music. That Mary Jane plays the organ in a church and teaches music. One of her aunts is a lead soprano in a church choir. The other aunt gives piano lessons to beginners. And many of those who are invited to the party are members of the church choir or pupils of the aunt or the niece. So the party that's at the core of the story The Dead will invoke the playing of music and singing. But it will also invoke a discussion about the relative merits of various singers and talk of opera and opera companies. So when the niece mentions Thomas's opera Mignon, she adds, it made her think of poor Georgina Burns. We don't know who poor Georgina Burns is. No footnote has ever helped us with this. Just sudden invocation of the music, bringing somebody who clearly is poor Georgina Burns, suggests someone who's dead. And so too her aunt says, there was only one tenor, to please me, I mean. His name was Parkinson. I heard him when he was in his prime, and I think he had the purest tenor voice that was ever put into a man's throat. So this idea of a singer whose voice is gone, the singer's gone, the singer's not heard of now, brings with it a sharp and shivering realization that time has passed and will pass again, that memories grow fainter. The fact that the memory is of a singer, rather than, say, a politician or a public figure, has an added pathos, because the power of the figure whose name is almost forgotten was not a fully temporal one. His fame came from breath, from his way of moving the human spirit through song. Music is placed at the forefront of the story to suggest an absence, as well as to do other work, such as the invocation of the spirit. This absence is a strangely political one, as much as it's a personal one, belonging to each of the characters. Somehow or other, because Dublin, in the year the story is set, the early year of the 20th century, it's a capital city of a country which has no parliament. It's in a time of peace or stability or stagnation between what was a possibility of what we call home rule, of the empire actually leaving Ireland, and the violence that began in 1914 with the First World War and led to the 1916 rebellion in Dublin and what we call the War of Independence. This strange time between 1890 and 1914, which is a time where almost nothing happened. And in this time, if you're setting a story, then it's a particularly interesting time to bring music in. And it's interesting that music ends up becoming a sort of utterance with power, because not much other utterance has power. There's no public utterance. So that the very private nature of music, the sheer privacy of music as utterance, takes on a special power in the Dublin of these years, as it does, for example, if you study the amount of music played or the way in which music became political in Catalonia in exactly the same years, or indeed in Scotland in exactly the same years, or indeed in Bengal in exactly the same years, all four places were nations, so to speak, without a parliament, or without nations which were not a state, which were waiting to become a state or would not become states, in which somehow or other the singing of a song, a love song, could have enormous implications about yearning, wanting, losing, being something you don't have being invoked, and that thing you don't have in being nationhood as much as love, so that the way in which music intertwines in the story, I think actually matters here. Towards the end of James Joyce's story, the tone changes. It moves into more and more private space as Gabriel, the protagonist, whose aunt's party this is, he stands in the hallway on the point of leaving, and he watches his wife, and she's standing on the stairs, and she's listening to a song. The song is coming from a room above. And as the song proceeds, the tone and diction of the story change. They move towards some level of mysterious feeling, which has been absent from the story up to now. Gabriel, quote, stood in the gloom of the hall, trying to catch the air that the voice was singing, and gazing up at his wife. There was a grace and mystery in her attitude, as if she were a symbol of something. Slowly then, as he listens in the hallway, he recognizes the song. The voice of the singer, Joyce writes, made plaintive by distance and by the singer's hoarseness, faintly illuminated the cadence of the air with words expressing grief. The words of the song and his wife's expression, how she stands, they fill Gabriel with desire for her. But for her, for Greta, his wife, the words of the song have reminded her of someone else who was once in love with her, with whom she had also been in love, a young man from the west of Ireland who had died years before. She tells her husband this as the story comes to an end in a Dublin hotel room after the party. And it is as though the very cadences of the song have moved the story into another realm, towards which it was reaching all the time, a realm beyond the realm of ordinary love, ordinary desire, ordinary memory. The story is moving towards a more mysterious space, almost a religious one, or one in which eternity becomes more important than time, and the dead more present than the living. Indeed, space itself, as the story moves towards its concluding sentences, moves out of the confines of walls and houses into the unknown, mysterious landscape of the west of Ireland, as though seen from the sky above. The cadences of the story move too, from the condition of prose towards the condition of music, or at least from the prosaic cadences of description and the everyday into cadences that seem closer to prayer or more elevated in their use of soft repetitions and sounds. In the second last paragraph, as Gabriel thinks of the young man, Michael Fury, the young man whom his wife had been in love, the dead man, he imagines that he sees his form standing under a dripping tree. This form then becomes a more abstract form or set of forms. The next sentence reads, "Other forms were near." It is clear that these forms are not material forms or forms that live in society or are at ease generally in the systems which fiction has invented for itself. The next sentence will use the word that Henry James used so sparingly and carefully. It will use the word soul. It will invoke a world that Thomas Mann seeks to invoke in that final scene, or in that section of the Magic Mountain. It will invoke the dead. It will read, "His soul had approached that region where dwell the vast hordes of the dead." The language is taking on tones that are almost archaic, which have echoes of the tones of prayer, or indeed the language of the Bible. It goes on, this is, quote, "He was conscious of but could not apprehend their wayward and flickering existence. His own identity was fading out into a grey, impalpable world. The solid world itself, which these dead had one time reared and lived in, was dissolving and dwindling." It is important to remember that the early parts of the story involve social encounters. They include Gabriel noticing the guests and the party with care and uneasy attention. This new tone in the story was created by a song, by the invocation of music in the body of a piece of fiction. The song has not merely caused a change in the patterns of the sentences, how they sound, but as with the song from Gounod's Faust in the Magic Mountain, it has invoked a realm that is not the normal realm of fiction. It has invoked the soul, the dead, the impalpable world. The last paragraph of the story, which has 9 sentences, begins with 3 simple sentences. It is only in the third one that the hushed, incantatory, totalizing sound that will take over the paragraph eventually can be heard. The flakes of snow are dark and silver, the adjectives coming after the noun all the more to heighten the sense of mystery and poetry here. It is in the 5th sentence that the prose style of what is being invoked begin to lift irrevocably from the mere social occasion, or indeed the occasion that is so much a part of fiction too, of a man thinking. And the end of the story, as we know, the famous end of the story reads, "It was falling, the snow," this is the snow, "it was falling on every part of the dark central plain, on the treeless hills, falling softly upon the bog of Allen, and farther westward, softly falling into the dark mutinous Shannon waves. It was falling too upon every part of the lonely churchyard on the hill where Michael Fury lay buried. It lay thickly drifted on the crooked crosses and headstones, on the spears of the little gate, on the barren thorns. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe, and faintly falling like the descent of their last end upon all the living and the dead.
Well, thanks so much for a, tour through your literary neighborhoods, if we can say so, your musical neighborhoods, taking us all the way from Edith Wharton and Thomas Mann and Ernest Hemingway and Virginia Woolf right to Joyce, Henry James, of course, to Joyce, and to Gabriel Byrne and Gabriel and the Dead in this marvelous story. Now, we will now take some time and perhaps develop some of the issues, and I'll begin with my own questions or observations, and then we'll see how our patience lasts in this room and how far we're getting, but perhaps people might also want to join in at some point at the moment. Now, there was, of course, a very interesting lacuna in the broad spectrum that you opened up, and you pointed us to this lacuna by the way you framed it, when you began with Nora Webster, your novel, but then never told us anything about it, except telling us all these musical and, in fact, religious issues, which the previous writers, colleagues of yours, dealt with, but which, of course, also bear very clearly on Nora Webster, where music itself is, well, the way by which he managed eventually to cope. So perhaps we can begin by sketching a little, the relationship between these literary neighbors or ancestors or forebears to your own work. Is this something that you find inspiring then, the way that Joyce, Mann, any of the others have used music for the way that, for instance, here, your characters develop music and discover music? Or do you take it from a different angle altogether?
Nora Webster is a widow. Sorry, is it?
Oh, you have to press the button.
Press the button. Nora Webster is a widow, and she's living in a small town, and she has no money, and it's the late 1960s. Now, my problem is what to do with her. I mean, Henry James is very interesting in the introduction to Portrait of a Lady. He says, well, what do you do with a young woman when you bring her from America? Well, she's going to marry somebody. So the novel is, who is she going to marry? My problem with Nora Webster is that she's not going to marry. She's been married already. She's not going to marry again. So what am I going to do with her? In other words, I need to do something with her. Now, I suppose if I were a better novelist or something, I could have her win the lottery, and she could then have a life of adventure. But to stay within the terms I've set myself, the world I want to, and she could maybe take up golf, but I can get nothing from golf. But so that in the town I'm from, in Enniscorthy, there was a gramophone society. And it seems such an innocent thing now and unimaginable almost that records were so expensive and people were so poor that once a week on a Thursday, and my mother, after the death of my father, that was the first time she went out. Every Thursday she would go to the Gramophone Society. And they would gather about 15 of them. They would sit around the record player. Of course, it reminded me so much of the record player in the Magic Mountain.
The ghosts invoked, yes.
So here you have it. And my mother would come home and describe, some of them had money. And they owned a lot of records. There was one man in particular who was addicted to German Lieder. I mean, Wolf, those sort of terrible, and he was always playing the Earl König, which my mother really could never see the point of. And there was a woman who would always conduct with her hand as though she was Herbert von Karajan, driving the others nuts, And this small world of music. But there was also a priest. I put him directly into the book. He's dead now, so he can't sue or anything. But he really did. He talked about the sopranos as though he knew them and lived with them. So he would talk about Maria Callas as though she were a known person, or Rita Strike. He was saying, "Oh, Maria and Rita," and he would Kathleen, meaning Kathleen Ferrier. He lived with soprano. He was obviously a bachelor. He was a priest. He was celibate. He was a good man, but he had this dream life with music.
So it began to interest me that how much you could do with this, as in, say, the last section of Buddenbrooks. You know, if you let music not only become a hobby, but suddenly begin to matter for her. I mean, matter. So she was getting something from music which was enriching her sensibility to the extent that she was being changed fundamentally from within.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose, though, the point here is it's vocal music, so it is singing. She's developing a voice.
But not only, it's also the Archduke Trio.
Okay, that's right, yes.
I mean,
okay,
I'm letting the Archduke Trio in here as, I mean, she obviously can't play. It's discovered that she has a singing voice, but it's not a very good one. She really fails in audition to get into a choir. She's not made a part of the choir. But nonetheless, the idea that in the aftermath of the novel, she will sing in the German Requiem, in Brahms's German Requiem, and that's sort of part of the novel. But no, the business of the Archduke Trio, the sort of ghostly sound of you know the opening of da 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 da, how much is held back a lot in the Archduke Trio, that begins to tantalize her and fascinate her. Also, the figure of Jacqueline de Prey at the center of this music. A young woman who could become anything. And so I was interested in what you could do with this. Now, what you have to do is you have to stick to the facts. In other words, if you let language take over, for example, if you say, when she put the needle on the record player, it was like the waves of the sea, you lose the novel completely. I mean, you know, once you begin with any form of simile, any form of metaphor, any form of flowery writing to describe music, you lose the novel. It must be described exactly as it, you know, you must find a tone for it as though you're giving someone directions, you know, to a shop in a city. Turn left, turn right, go there, look for that. You know, you have to be very, very careful not to let in an attempt to musicalize the prose.
Is it because language can't carry the music, or music can't be, well, described, evoked in language, or what?
Yes, it's because of that, but it's also because the reader will not tolerate it. The reader's irony is something you really have to always keep in mind, that readers read ironically, and if they think this is can I say bullshit here?
You may.
If this is flowery, if this is too much, the reader will pull back, which is one of the reasons why the novelist is uneasy about music, as to what to do about it.
I suppose there's another level, though, perhaps in the way in which music is relevant here. Like, it's not really a novel that is enormously full of action or plotting. Nothing much really happened, although many things do happen. It is not strong on plotting. It is more about situations, constellations, nuances, atmospheric changes, really, in the way that this family constellation is reconstructing itself. And I thought a great deal about sort of the relevance of the quotation I gave when you say what interests you is relationships in books rather than perhaps actions and characters. Isn't music pure relationship in that sense, that it is something that gives us a constellation rather than an action, rather than a plot? Music doesn't necessarily tell stories. It gives us, well, structures to think about, to dream over, the way that you described it.
I mean, one of the ways you could describe this book is it's Madame Bovary with no Madame and no Bovary. You know, in other words, that there's no adultery, or Anna Karenina, or Anna Karenina with no train. You know that in other words, but I just wonder about that idea of relationships. I'm not sure I'm that interested in relationships as much as I'm interested in sensibility, in the idea of a particular individual who takes up more or less all the space, as an individual will in a Rembrandt painting, or indeed an individual almost does in a Vermeer painting. So therefore, because music can actually affect a sensibility very deeply in ways which are mysterious and clear, you can work with that. And that also builds up to the idea that I've been trying to talk about there too, the idea of soul, the idea that the life within, which is, again, very difficult for a novelist to deal with, the life within, because novels are so filled with the things that are on the table, and they're so not filled with ideas of redemption. And ideas of redemption are really not available to the novelist. So, therefore, with those two things, with sensibility being open to things, music being one, and sensibility itself being a word, maybe another word for soul, so that those things then began to interest me.
Yeah. Here is a quotation: "Thou lovely art, in how many grey hours when the wild round of life ensnared me, hast thou kindled my heart to warm love and carried me into a better world." It's a translation of a Schubert song that the character is singing.
Yes.
Du holde Kunst. It's an address to music. In wie viel grauen Stunden, wo mich des Lebens wilder Kreis umstickt, hast du mein Herz mit warmer Lieb umrunden, hast mich in eine bessere Welt entrückt, has carried me into a better world. Is that an aspiration for art, to carry us into a better world?
No, I was literally using the song. I was trying to think of a song that they might sing, that she might be able to learn. So, An die Musik, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
That I thought that would be a song she could sing. Kathleen Ferrier sings it. Victoria de los Angeles sings it. A lot of singers who weren't German sang it. It was really, really in the repertoire. It was not the Erlkönig. Yeah. It was one of the sort of soft Schubert songs. So I was using a real song before I was invoking the meaning of the song. And then, of course, the fact that it was written by someone who's clearly, or not clearly, but pretty clearly in love with Schubert, who was a man.
Yes.
That I could throw that in for good luck. That there was a sort of element of just the only reference to gay relationships
by Schubert
is where the woman says, "Oh, the words were written by a man. He was completely in love with Schubert." And they were both men. And, "Oh, isn't that wonderful?" And, "Oh, okay, that's something else new to her in a provincial town in Ireland in 1969.
But that relationship between music and religion, chant and enchantment, that you've been speaking about so powerfully right now, isn't that also threatening, dangerous perhaps? This is, I suppose, what the Magic Mountain scene is all about, how music is a demonic force also to reckon with, or indeed Dr. Faustus, Mann's novel, Dr. Faustus, where music is the art by which the protagonist enters the pact with the devil. Isn't there something in this musical, capacity to go beyond language, to beyond words, that is dangerous to dabble with?
Yes, it's very interesting in Mann, for example, that he can associate music with death, that it's almost his interest in music in Buddenbrooks, which causes Hanno, you feel, to die. That it's associated with decadence, with decay, with illness in Buddenbrooks. And of course, by the time he comes 40 years later to writing, or even more, writing Faustus, he's really interested with the help, into the consternation of Schoenberg, using Adorno, asking Adorno constantly to try and find him. For example, the Devil's Trill Sonata by Tartini becomes important, or a chord in church music that's forbidden because it suggests the devil, and the way in which Adrian Leverkuhn will in fact write music that will almost bring the devil into the room. But the problem Schoenberg had with this was that Mann was using the 12-tone system, and there was a woman called Alma Mahler who caused nothing but trouble, I think, all her life. And she went to Schoenberg and said, "Everyone is talking about you." They were all living in California at this time, and said, "Everyone's talking about you. You made a pact with the devil, everyone now thinks." So Mann had to put a note in the book, that in addition, to say, this is not about Schoenberg, thus drawing further attention to Schoenberg. But I think that was an idea that Mann had about music, which I think, I would like to remove. I just think sometimes it becomes too much. He gives music a symbolic force, which I didn't want it to have in this book. I wanted it merely to be something that would fill her spirit enough to nourish her spirit so that she could live. But of course it matters what the music is, because when they're going to sing the German Requiem, it matters that these Catholic country,
it's not even
going
Catholic Requiem.
I mean, it's certainly not a Catholic. It's the
Yeah.
most Protestant piece of music, and she's invoking the fact that she heard it first in a convent, and so there are all sorts of. It isn't as though any of this music invoked here is music without content. I mean, it's not. It cannot be pure, but nonetheless, in man, it becomes really symbolic and resonant in a way that I don't really want it to be all the time here.
So talking about your literary neighbors, your artistic neighbors, any of the ones that we've mentioned, do you choose them, or do you feel you are chosen by them? Do you adopt these neighborhoods, or are you adopted?
I mean, I think that, yes, I think that with reading, it's a very intense process, and the books that matter to you, that you can't just decide, I'm from this moment onwards, I'm going to become an enormous, aficionado of, George Eliot, when George Eliot doesn't. No. It is again a matter of sensibility, and you can't. You can work on your sensibility. But I was going to say only God can give you your sensibility, but I don't even believe in God. So you just get your sensibility anyway. You have it all along.